Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this session. My name's Rob Farrow, and I'm going to be talking to you today about AI and open education. And I'll be arguing for the need for open and critical perspectives in the unfolding deployment of AI into education systems and processes. Um, just a bit about me to start off. Um, so. I am a senior research fellow at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK, which is the largest UK university. I'm a philosopher by discipline background, and I've been working as an educational technologist and researcher in open education since around 2011, something like that. In IET, I'm the program lead for Learning in Open World, which is one of our research programs. I'm the co-director of the Global OER Graduate Network, GoGN, and I'm also the co-editor of the Journal of Interactive Media in Education. Just a brief word about GoGN before we move on. You might be interested in the network, which exists to support research in open education, with a special focus on doctoral education, but it can be anywhere in the world. GoGen's free to join, and it's a great place to network with people who are doing research. You can also check out some of the OER that we produce to help researchers. Again, it's all free to download and openly licensed, so check out the website. So on to today's presentation. I'm going to try and briefly talk through 4 arguments around openness and AI. Obviously, this is an area where there's still a lot of debate going on. And in some ways, you might not necessarily agree with everything that I'm going to put forward. But what I'm trying to do is offer some sort of foundational arguments around what it means to be open in the AI space. So what are we talking about with openness and AI? I think the first thing I would like to note is that AI is not the solution to a specific problem. We don't need AI in the strictest sense. It's a more kind of a general tool in some ways that we can apply to lots of different scenarios. But I think we're kind of going to get AI, right? And it's already happening. But it's worth bearing in mind that there's sort of a choice underlying this around how it happens. When you think about some of the more kind of interesting and innovative aspects of AI, I think about things like this: personalized instructions, tutoring systems that respond, new kinds of games and simulations, different kinds of pedagogies based around the ability to manipulate language and images, video, and so on. And generally speaking, ways in which we can automate some of the pedagogical and administrative aspects of education. And so some genuinely innovative stuff going on. And although I'm going to be kind of critical about AI, I don't want you to think that I don't recognize that these are interesting possibilities and potentially revolutionary. Here you have a breakdown of different possible roles that you can get ChatGPT to do in relation to learning. And there's some genuinely interesting stuff going on. I always think the idea of a Socratic component is quite an interesting one, having come from philosophy. And so there's lots of interesting work being done around this stuff at the moment. When I'm talking about open education, and bearing in mind that it can mean slightly different things in different places, if you think of this wheel like a clock face, the way I've organized this is that I think widening participation is part of everyone's concept of open education. And as you move around the clock face clockwise, I think these are things that get a little bit more contentious. So moving around as we go towards the end, you get things like social justice, decolonization, critical pedagogy. And some people would argue that they're not, strictly speaking, part of open education. I think that they are, although I'm not going to have time to argue for all of that today. But that gives you a sense of the kind of things that I'm talking about with open education. And some of them will probably be quite familiar to people at this conference, maybe others less so. And then, we're getting on to kind of the intersection between open and AI. And of course, there is a very famous, maybe the most famous AI company. It's called OpenAI. But is it open? I ask you. Maybe you can kind of tell where this is going. The answer is not really. And it's potentially quite a classic case of what we call open washing. Um, and there's an interesting sort of battle for the soul of AI going on with OpenAI, the company. And you may or may not be aware of its history, and the way it was set up with a non-profit and a board and a for-profit board as well. And that non-profit side seems to be losing, right? So there's some interesting stuff going on with that company. Um, what makes this a bit more complex than it might first appear is that we don't really have good definitions for what OpenAI is in the first place. And so that leaves a little bit of space there for people to interpret that and present it the way they wish. Um, there's also a sense in which the actual technologies that AI use are not transparent. They are kind of closed technologies. Um, for reasons of commercial interest, they want to keep them closed, but the open branding gives you the positive connotation, classic open washing. But even if that wasn't the case, AI systems are not very democratic because just to be involved in making them and using them requires an enormous amount of effort, computing power, energy, data, and so on. And just saying, well, we use open source software doesn't really kind of cut, that much. Um, I'd also say that the way that training data works doesn't really comply to our concepts of what openness means. I'll say more about that in the next slide. I'll return to some of these aspects as we go on. One way of thinking about the difference with LLMs compared with open source software is that we have more parameters with LLMs. And you can see this is from a paper in Nature. It's not just the code itself, it's the data that you used, it's how the algorithm weights those data points, whether the API is open, and so on. And so there's a kind of technical side to that, which challenges this idea of just because it's open source, that means it's open. So you could say more about OpenAI, and I'll say a bit more as we progress. But the question that's kind of underlying this and motivating this is around what does an authentically open AI look like, or an authentically open AI in education? I'm going to have to be maybe too brief here in terms of trying to get across what I want in the time that's available. My first point is around the need for a socio-technical perspective rather than a solutionist perspective. What do I mean? Well, when you think about kind of the use of these tools at the endpoint, you just kind of interact with, a screen of ChatGPT in a browser or something, and you don't really sort of see what happens and how the whole system works. You just kind of have the interface. And this is true of a lot of technologies that we use in general. Here you can see technology stack where the actual interface you use is on the right, but there's a big series of different technological platforms behind that allow it to work, but they're kind of hidden from the end user. This is from Kate Crawford's Anatomy of AI. And it's a little bit too detailed to really see that well. And you could spend 20 minutes just talking through this image. What it shows is all the different supply chains that feed into the production of an Amazon smart speaker running Alexa. And so this includes, massive environmental impacts, different kinds of local and global infrastructure, extraction of rare minerals, the human labor associated with that, with algorithmic training, and so on. And so there's a lot going on that's basically hidden from the end user with these technologies. What's being hidden by the way that this works? Generally bad stuff, right? Like environmental destruction and abuse of people's personal property, medical data, all kinds of stuff going on. And you can probably name your own horror stories about this kind of thing. One interesting example of an AI project maybe gone wrong that I think in some ways illustrates where we're at with some of this stuff. Here in the UK, in London, Amazon had a store, an AI store, and you would be able to go inside, just pick up whatever you wanted to, and walk out. And the idea was that the AI systems would identify the things that you'd taken and they just charge your bank account. And turns out that this never worked, and they were just trying to fake it. And the way that they faked it was that they had many poor souls in India watching these cameras all day, and trying to identify when someone picks something up and, they weren't particularly good at that, and why would they be? And the whole thing was just basically a bit of a con. And it recalls the kind of classic Mechanical Turk, where you would believe that you were playing chess against a robot, but in fact there was a human being hidden inside that you were really playing against. And I think in some ways that's, um, emblematic of the kind of situation that we find ourselves in now, where there are some big claims going on around what these technologies can do. It's not to say that they're not impressive, but we can be easily focused on the kind of small impressive part, and think about the kind of pedagogical innovations that come from that. But then we're missing a big part of the big picture around all the different impacts and potential harms that can result from this kind of technology. So my first point, which I think in terms of making these technologies work for everyone, how does that, what does that look like? I would say that's an aspect of the openness part of this. And so as a result, we have to consider the comprehensive impacts of AI, not just whether it's used for a particular pedagogical or administrative function. The second dimension I'd like to explore briefly is around explicability and transparency. And with some of the issues I've already mentioned around AI, the purported solution a lot of the time is that people will say, oh, we just need to make it explicable. We need to be able just to show people what's happening inside the algorithm or show people what's happening inside the system, and they won't be as bothered about the whole thing as before. There's nothing to worry about here. And I think it's fair to say that the idea of transparency and the idea of openness are linked, right? I think we should have as much transparency as possible, or as expected or as justified within our AI systems. And so this concept of explainable AI or explicable AI, I think, is one that we should be endorsing within open education. There's an ethical framework that was published a few years ago, and it identifies this idea of explicability as a core ethical feature of AI going forward. So for AI systems as a whole, we need to be able to explain how they work, who makes the decisions, and so on. And so I'm kind of endorsing this in the sense that I think there are good arguments for saying we should make this kind of explicable system the default expectation for how AI is deployed. And I think we can characterize that as a kind of openness concern. However, when you look into this concept of explicability or explainability, there's kind of complexity there, because it's one thing to say, oh yeah, we just make it explicable. But then the question that kind of follows from that is, well, explicable to who? A technical expert, a teacher, an educator, a student, a manager? Who is this being explained to? And what are their kind of preconceptions that they're bringing to this? Do they really understand if you were to explain in detail, say, an algorithm? And I think we may need some sort of new roles, some new expertise around this in terms of brokering these things and being able to explain the same kind of stuff to different audiences. One way of maybe thinking about that, you can see on this flow chart here, is that we think explainability means two different things. On the one hand, interpretability, something you can communicate, and on the other hand, fidelity or truthfulness, the real thing that's happening inside the algorithm and this kind of thing. And so where do those two things meet? Should we be expected to explain those two things to the same audiences and so on? And also, if we make these processes transparent, does that have an impact on learning and pedagogy? Most pedagogies are not transparent, although maybe they should be. So my argument here for number 2 is that transparency is necessary, explicability is necessary. They both conform with the idea of openness, but there's problems around that, or at least let's say complexities around that. If you're interested, I have a paper which talks about some of this stuff. The link's here, you can find it in the slides. So my third point is around learning materials and open educational resources. And this is a combination that gets a lot of people pretty excited: ChatGPT plus OER. And you can see why, right? Because it potentially makes the process of OER creation and adaptation and repurposing and so on extremely easy compared to not doing it with an AI. And David Wiley recently came out and has written in support of this idea that we should be having looking for these crossover points between generative AI and OER and seeing that as part of the same mission of increasing access to education. Here you can see a paper which explores AI as a route to the implementation of the UNESCO OER recommendation, high-level strategic stuff. This is the University of New Mexico now offers a program for developing OER with AI. And that just shows you kind of how much people are getting behind this concept together. I would like to note that there are some issues with using ChatGPT or similar GPTs to create OER. And part of this is around just the reliability of what they produce. I prefer bullshit to hallucinate in terms of when these errors happen, partly because hallucinate implies that something's having a conscious experience, which can be true or false. But obviously, GPTs don't have experiences; they don't hallucinate, even in the metaphorical kind of sense. But they do spew out content, not necessarily caring whether it's true or not. And this is using bullshit in the philosophical sense, which does exist actually, in case you don't believe me. Is Harry Frankfurt's book on bullshit. So there's an issue there around just the reliability of this kind of stuff. But I find the more interesting one is actually to do with intellectual property. And in this case, what's happening is we're just hoovering up massive amounts of data from various places, and then feeding it all into data sets that are then used to create new content. So essentially what's happening is, depending on how you interpret that, copyrighted material goes in one end, what comes out the other end can't be copyrighted according to current case law. Therefore, by default, it's public domain. So there's something interesting happening there. And if you're a creative or a writer, you may not feel very happy about this, right? Because lots of people are getting their creative works repurposed. And most recently, if you're an academic who publishes, the big publishers are now selling off access to all of your papers to the AI companies as we speak. There's something not quite resolved around all this. OpenAI has this ongoing court case with the New York Times where OpenAI is being sued by the New York Times for basically, reproducing content from the New York Times as output in GPTs. And here you can see a comparison. Like under any normal circumstances, the red text is the same in both. And under any normal circumstances, that would be a copyright violation, right? It's like 98% the same or something. But we're kind of not really in a normal situation in a lot of ways. And I think it will be case law that decides what you can and can't do with this stuff. In the meantime, what's happening? Well, all those kind of those people who've got your data in the cloud and this kind of thing, they're now using that to train AIs. And you can see here Dropbox, Adobe has the same sort of thing, kind of changes to terms and conditions. And the OpenAI CTO was asked about this. And you can have a look at the video on this link. And they either don't understand the concept of intellectual property or they're being extremely evasive about it. The guy from Microsoft AI just said, yeah, you can just take it because it's open on the web. And that's not really the view of intellectual property that people in the open education movement aspire to, as far as I am aware. There's also some interesting stuff going on around licensing, and Creative Commons are kind of looking at updates to licenses or add extra clause to the licenses around whether or not things can be used for training data. Ultimately, it seems to me that the AI companies just don't care anyway, right, about that stuff. So they're just going to do it regardless. But within the open space, we've done so much to kind of carve out a space for legitimate intellectual property being made open. I think there's something to be done to kind of preserve that or to anticipate where things might go legally. I don't know yet. I mean, they're still unfolding. my last kind of argument is around inclusion, which I also associate with open approaches. And in this case, it's about inclusive research, which involves multiple perspectives on this phenomenon of AI. And partly there's an issue here around algorithmic biases, which have been shown to favor particular demographics, such as white men, who are often the basis of the training sets, the early kind of training sets especially. I don't really have time to go into all of the aspects around algorithmic bias here. I'm going to assume that people are kind of familiar with it. But this is one of the reasons why we need more inclusive approaches, is to counter this kind of bias. A recent meta review around the use of AI in higher education also found that when you look at the reviews that are out there, most of them are of lower quality. Most of them are coming from North America. I'm not saying those two things are linked, right? Most of the research is just done in North America. But there is a need for addressing the biases that exist within the community and within open education as well, by being more inclusive and trying to have a more procedurally driven idea of arriving at understanding around this stuff. And again, something else I don't really have time to argue for today is that I think we can draw quite a close connection between the idea of being open and the idea of being critical. And I would argue that openness has implicit social and political dimensions and proceeds from the assumption that we need to question the status quo, right? If you're perfectly happy with everything, why would you be interested in openness, right? Openness is about overcoming some barriers. It's about engaging with circumstances and engaging with reality. I have a paper which kind of deals with some of these themes, which you can access here in the slides. Another paper which I think treads similar ground is this paper by Jasmine Roberts-Crew around the Black feminist pedagogical origins of open education. Again, both of these kind of things, these sources that I'm talking about are kind of rooted in this idea of critical pedagogy and making an association between critical pedagogy and open education. So that's my point 4, and that's obviously around inclusion. And then I know we're kind of running a bit low on time. So here are my 4 points again: socio-technical perspectives, emphasis on transparency and explicability, finding an ethical route to intellectual property, and inclusion in the research process. I know that it can sometimes feel a bit like we're not really given a choice about what's happening, and your choice is, do you want to go fast or faster with AI? And I think that's just something that we're going to have to kind of try to navigate as a community, really. I think maybe we should go to some questions, right? Because I've only got a couple of slides left, but I think I can skip them. Thank you very much for listening. By the way, I can't see the chat at the moment, so let me see if I can get it up. Okay, do we have any questions?
I have a question, Rob. This is Robin DeRosa.
Hi, Robin.
My question is, your tone is so soothing. And I guess I want to know, like, emotionally, how do you feel inside? Because honestly, and I just saw Jasmine's presentation just before I came to this, and it was like gobsmacking, outstanding, but also really distressing. And I guess I want to know, like, how distressed are you? Because I can feel the subtext of distress, and I share a lot of your perspectives, and I'm really like frightened about a lot of things. So I just want to know, how are you feeling about that, and what do you do with that?
Yes, I'm feeling okay about it. I mean, I think if you're used to coming from a kind of critical theory sort of perspective, which is where I've been I've been working in that space for quite a long time. There's always something to be worried about in that sense. As far as AI goes, I'm kind of getting a bit more on board with it in the sense that a lot of the kind of concerns that I've had, I'm sort of trying to reconcile those in a bigger sense of progress of some sort, even if it's not universally good progress. It's like things are moving. I found that finding ways like part of what motivates me with this is that if we don't engage with it and if we don't develop positions and argue for them, it's just going to be something that happens to us instead, passively. And I think there's something to play for with this stuff. It can make a difference if we find inclusive routes. It can make a difference if we think about the bigger systems that are at play. Can make a difference if we think about new ways to make things more transparent as opposed to what the alternatives are. So I think there are things to play for there. Um, I don't think we're really ready for what's happening, but I'm not sure you ever could be in a way. But I think we're obliged to engage with it, and we have to do that in a kind of as upbeat a fashion as we can, really. But the other thing that I note about this is that there's this concept I've been working with recently, which is wonder panic, and it's this idea of a kind of contradictory emotion towards something, where on the one hand, it's awesome in the literal sense, but it also is scary, and those two things kind of coexisting together. And I've been thinking about like when people in like learned how to make fire or something, right? Okay, that was probably quite scary at one level, but it was also there was something empowering in there as well. And so I'm kind of working with this wonder panic concept a bit as well to see like where does that lead? Can it at least kind of keep the wolf from the gate for a bit and let you get on with something rather than be paralyzed by it? I hope that's kind of a reasonable response. I'm just looking through the questions in the chat. Elaine, this threatens to disrupt traditional pedagogies. Well, if you look at something like ChatGPT, that can have a very disruptive effect on writing-based pedagogies. The new forms of expertise thing is really about saying, okay, if we have this idea of being explicable, and we say, well, explicable to who? What does it mean to be explicable? You could say that it could be someone whose job is, and their form of expertise, which is new, is they're kind of a broker between these different stakeholders. So they understand how the AI systems work to quite a high level, but they're able to explain it in sort of simple language and to different people in a way that makes sense to them. Or another possibility is something like an auditor who might go from between different institutions and just run tests on the AI systems and see is it working right? Is it fair? Is it balanced? Is it accurately weighted? And all that sort of stuff. So yeah, thinking about those kind of things in relation to that. Um,
So unfortunately, we are out of time.
yep, no worries.
But thank you, Robert, for that wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure.